pull that out this morning. Start a new series of messages today, and the title of the series is Home Improvement, and I got that from a series of messages that Rick Warren did 23 years ago. I went to a conference in California in 1998, seems like just the other day, and anyway, he told us that we could use portions of his sermons and stuff like that. So I don't do much of that very often, but occasionally I'll borrow from another preacher. And so I sent him an email and told him I did a better job than he did at preaching it, but I never heard back from him for some reason, so can't imagine why. Anyway, so some of this that we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks, I borrowed from Rick Warren, so I want to be sure and give him credit for that. So. Last Thursday, Charlotte and I celebrated our 43rd wedding anniversary. So 43 years, so thank you. How many of you guys have been married for more than 40 years? Wow, look at that. Great. Boy, howdy. A bunch of you. Okay, we got some experts here this morning then. And we're going to talk about marriage today and how to have a happy marriage, the elements of a happy marriage and a happy relationship. And some of you I know are not married, and so you say, well, I might as well leave, right? No, this will apply to you too, because a lot of what we're going to look at will work in any relationship that you have. Not everything, but some of it will. And so I hope that the Lord will use that to bless you and your other relationships. And you may be getting married someday. Never say never, right? Sometimes that happens. Or if you're not married yet and you're young, you're going to be getting married, most likely. So I hope that this will be something that will stick with you and will be helpful to you in your marriage relationship. So anyway, the elements of a happy marriage. And I have a couple of verses at the top of the outline I want to begin with. One of them is from Hebrews 13 and verse 4, where the writer says, "Give honor to marriage and remain faithful to one another in marriage." And so marriage is both an honor and a duty. This passage shows us that marriage is an honor. It's a privilege to be married and to have a spouse. And so I'd just be beside myself if I'd not had this relationship with Charla over all these years. And I truly believe that the Lord brought us together, that He brought her into my life and brought me into her life because He intended from the very beginning, for us to be husband and wife. And so that's a beautiful thing, and that's something that the Lord works out and has in mind, I believe, for most of us. There are some that God intends to remain single, so there's nothing wrong with that. You may be one of those. But for most of us, the Lord intends for us to have a spouse. And so it's an honorable thing, and it's something that we should be thankful for and give praise and glory to the Lord for. But it's also a duty. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 7:3, he said, "A husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise a wife to her husband." Now, if you go back and look at the context of that verse, he's actually talking about a sexual relationship, that the husband and wife need to meet each other's needs in that regard. But certainly there are other duties as well, aren't there? There are responsibilities that we have to fulfill in the marriage relationship, meeting each other's needs and those sorts of things. And so marriage is both an honor and a duty. It's a responsibility. And certainly the Lord shows us from His Word how we can be better spouses, how we can be better marriage partners in that relationship. So what does it take to have a strong marriage relationship? Each one of these things we're going to look at starts with the letter C. So we're going to call this the 6 C's. So, and again, some of these, the first 3 especially, would apply to any relationship, whether it's a boss or employee or a neighbor or friend. So some of these things have dual application. What's it take to have a strong marriage? The first one we're going to talk about is communication. Communication. And I suppose I should say positive communication, right? Sometimes we communicate, but it's not a positive thing. Some of us have no problem expressing our viewpoint, getting our point across to our spouses or to someone else, but perhaps we don't do that in the proper way, right? So, positive communication. And communication and the breakdown of communication is many times the reason so many couples are struggling. They're just not connecting. They're not talking. They're not working out the problems and details in their relationship. So communication is very important. In Ephesians 4:29, the Bible says, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths. I noticed in the Holman Standard Bible it says, don't let any rotten talk come out of your mouth. That's literally what the word means. But only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. So when we talk to our spouses or to someone else, it should always be done in such a way to build them up. Even when you're rebuking somebody, even when you're saying, I don't agree with you, or even when you are expressing anger about something, your dislike about something, you can do it in a positive, uplifting way. It's important to do that. I got a book in my office somewhere called The 1 Minute Manager that I got many, many years ago somewhere, and I read it. I remember it said one of the things that a good employer will do is to hold employees accountable. And if they're doing something that's wrong, or they're not doing their job right, or whatever, it says you need to be firm and you need to be assertive in addressing the problem and go up to them and just tell them in a nutshell, look, you're not doing this right. And then it says immediately after that to compliment them on something that they're doing correctly. It says in that way you're letting them know that they're not fulfilling your expectations about something, but you're doing it in a positive way. You're building them up. And you're saying, even though you're weak in this area, you're really strong over here, and I appreciate what you're doing over here, but you need to grow in this. This is a growth area in your work, and you need to improve. So you see how you can even take a negative thing, and you can be positive in the way you communicate your intentions to somebody. We need to be very careful about that in marriage. Many times I find myself being hateful and unkind and condescending sometimes, and so we have to be careful, don't we, in the way that we express ourselves to our spouses. It's very, very important. The Bible says so. I looked up last night and found out something very interesting. I wanted to know how much time during the day a couple spends communicating with each other. And I found something on the Oprah.com website, so we know it's true, okay? And this said during a 1 hour meal, somebody researched this, I guess, and they said during a 1 hour meal with your spouse, how much time do you spend talking during that meal? Now, some of the time you're eating, right? But how much of the time during a 1 hour meal would you spend in conversation with your spouse, just talking about things? Now, get this. They said after 20 years of marriage, the average couple during a 1 hour meal would spend 21 minutes talking, just chatting, visiting. After a 30-year marriage, it drops down to 16 minutes. Now get this, after 50 years of marriage, and a couple has an hour-long meal together, they said the average conversation time between that couple is 3 minutes. Okay? And some of you can testify, right? Some of us, even though we haven't been married 50 years, we're already there, right? We're not spending much time talking and communicating with each other. And so that's very eye-opening. You know how much time most average people spend watching TV every day? Probably about 4 hours. Average time for most folks, some of you are above average, some of you are below. Average person spends about 4 hours watching television. Now, years ago, it was about 6 hours. It dropped down to 4 hours. You know why it dropped down to 4 hours? Because most people spend about 4 hours on their smartphone. So, about 4 hours on the smartphone and about 4 hours on television. That's 8 hours every day doing those things. But think about how little time we spend talking to our spouses, communicating, just talking. And so no wonder we have a breakdown in communication. It's something that's a real problem in our culture. And so we need to find a way to solve that problem. You know, take a walk or, do something together. Spend more time together. Turn the television off. Charlotte would probably be shocked to death if I just turned the TV off and we just sat and looked at each other and talked, And she's usually on her iPad. She's not watching TV all the time, but she's got that iPad most of the time. And what if she put that down and we turned the television off and we just sat down and just looked at each other? That'd be odd, wouldn't it? Be very weird. Be strange. But I'm sure eventually we'd both find something to talk about. You know, we'd start talking. We'd start chatting. She'd probably say, turn the TV back on, or let me turn the iPad back on, or at least we'd be talking. And so it's really a problem. I have another book in my office I got years ago, and this was like 29 years ago when this came out, but it's still applicable. It's by Gary Chapman. It's called The 5 Love Languages. Any of y'all ever read that? The 5 Love Languages? And so it kind of shows, even it's still true today, that men and women communicate differently. You know, we're just different. God designed us different. We're different by design. And so you have to understand your spouse's love language, what's really important to her, what's really important to him, and how you can better communicate with one another. And the only way you can do that is to know what that love language is. And so if you haven't read that book, I would recommend it. I think it's very good. So positive communication is very, very important. I think most wives would say that's a big problem. The biggest issue or challenge in their marriage, perhaps, is a lack of communication. We just don't talk. We don't visit as much as we should. So communication. The second C is consideration, showing consideration for your spouse. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 1:10, you must get along with each other. You must learn to be considerate of one another, cultivating a life in common. And so to show consideration to your spouse, to show that you really care, that you really understand how he or she feels, and to kind of relate to what they're going through at any given time. Be considerate of one another. Men sometimes, I think, take our wives for granted. You know, men are kind of like hunters, you know, and we're single issue type guys. You go out and we achieve something, and then we think we're done, you know. So I've got my wife now, so now I move on to other things, you know. But you have to continue to cultivate that relationship, and so you have to be considerate of one another's feelings. Even again, if you disagree, you need to be considerate of how the other person feels. In college, I had a class where they tried to show us how to understand what another person is trying to say. And they showed us, and I think it's true, that most of us, when we're in a conversation with someone, especially if it's a heated conversation, we're not really listening to what they're saying. We're just waiting for them to shut up so we can jump in, right? That's how most of us probably are. And so we're not being very considerate. We're not really thinking about, you know, how does she feel about this, even if you don't agree. And so in this class I took, they taught us they called it reflecting. Reflect back to the person you're talking to exactly what they're saying, but maybe put it in different words. And so we had to do this in our class with classmates. And so somebody would say something to us, and then I had to reflect it back, you know, and say, here's what I hear you're saying, you know, and that's kind of a little catchphrase among counselors. I hear what you're saying, you know. You're trying to reflect back to them exactly what they're saying. And that's to help them to understand that you get it, that you recognize how they feel about something. Even if you don't agree, even if you think they're wrong, you should try that. Say, well, okay, I understand what you're saying. Here's how you feel about this, and I understand that this is upsetting to you. And so you kind of reflect that back, and that shows your spouse that you really do understand. Then you can say, but now here's how I feel about it, and try to understand where I'm coming from. And so communication is important, but the way you do it is important too. So be considerate to one another. I'm probably not the most considerate person on earth, especially in my marriage. Sometimes I'm just not real kind. And I have a tendency to just say what I think, you know, at least to my wife. Now, I kind of filter that a little bit with other people, you know. Why is that? You know, I'll filter it with others, but not necessarily with her. And I feel like I'm just being totally honest, you know. But sometimes being totally honest is kind of troublesome or hurtful, isn't it? You know, like the guy who had his wife come out with a nice new dress on and everything, and she's walking around in her dress. And she says, well, honey, does this dress make me look fat? Well, that's a loaded question, isn't it? And he didn't miss a beat, and he said, no, it's not the dress, it's your hips that make you look fat. You know, I mean, that's not very considerate, is it? So think before you talk. You know, try to be nice. Try to be uplifting. Remember, let no corrupt communication Let no rotten communication come out of your mouth. Be friendly, be kind, be one who's affirming and building a person up. That's the way we should be. Be considerate. And then in 1 Peter 3:7, Peter said, husbands, in the same way, talking about the husband and wife relationship, show consideration for your wives in your life together. So again, I think that many times this is a guy problem. Not saying that women can't do this as well. They certainly can. But sometimes us men have a little bit of problem being considerate in our wives' feelings, especially if you're the type guy that doesn't care much for feelings or emotion and things like that. It may be something you're not really completely understanding or appreciating that's coming from your wife. I've got this old clipping I found somewhere. This thing came out in 1955, okay? So it's as old as I am. And this is from the Saturday Evening Post. This is a true clipping from the Saturday Evening Post. So this was 66 years ago. And it's the 7 ages of the cold. And it's about a couple and how their relationship progresses over the years, and the husband's concern for his wife, his consideration for something that's happening to his wife, okay? Now, some things never change, so I think this still applies. And so it goes through the stages of marriage, tracing a husband's response to his wife's cold. The wife has a cold, and so the husband is responding to this, okay? See if this sounds true. In the first year of their marriage, the wife has a bad cold, and the husband responds by saying, sugar dumpling, I'm worried about my baby girl. You've got a bad sniffle. There's no telling about these things. With all this strep going around, I'm going to put you in the hospital this afternoon for a general checkup and a good rest. Now, I know the food in the hospital is lousy, but I'll bring you meals from Rossini's. I've already worked it out with the restaurant. I'm going to take care of you. That's the first year. Second year, he's bad cold, and the husband says, listen, darling, I don't like the sound of that cough. I've called Doc Miller to rush right over here. You can tell this was years ago when doctors made house calls. Now, you go to bed like a good girl just for me. I'm going to take care of you. Third year, maybe you better lie down. Nothing like a little rest when you're feeling puny. I'll bring you something to eat. Have we got any soup? Now we get up to the fourth year. Look, dear, be sensible. After you feed the kids and get the dishes washed, you better hit the sack. Then we get to the fifth year. Why don't you just get up and take a couple of aspirin? Then we get to the sixth year. If you'll just gargle or something instead of sitting there barking like a seal. And then the seventh year. For Pete's sake, stop sneezing. What are you trying to do? Give me pneumonia? Now, there's some truth in that, isn't there? I mean, that first year, just like parents with a new child, you know, that first year or so, especially with the very first child, boy, you're so careful and all that, and you won't let anything get near them. You're protecting them from all these germs and everything. Then the second kid comes along, you just let them do anything, right? You kind of learn from experience, and you kind of change the way you do things. Sometimes we're not nearly as considerate as we were when we first began a relationship as we are after some time has gone by, right? Now, some folks are different. Some folks are the exception, and that's wonderful, but most of us probably struggle with that. So show consideration to your spouse. The third C is compromise. Be willing to compromise. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 13:5, love does not demand its own way. In that chapter, he talks about faith, hope, and love, and he says the greatest of these is love, and he says love is not demanding. It does not demand its own way. Love thinks about the needs of the other person, not just yourself, not just being self-centered, but what does she need or what does he need, and how could I go about helping the person I love have happiness and joy in his or her life. That's what it's all about. Instead of just thinking about yourself. I think humans, because of our sinful nature, we're kind of self-centered. Aren't we kind of think about ourselves most of the time? But a compassionate, loving spouse is someone who's going to think about the needs of the other person. How could I meet their needs? Probably more marriages die today from inflexibility than from abuse or from alcohol or even infidelity. It's just a lack of flexibility, a lack of trying to meet the other person's needs, to show that person that you're willing to compromise. And so as you're communicating, it's important, I think, in my experience and from the Scriptures, to talk about problems, talk about the issues that are causing trouble. And don't be hesitant to do that. Sometimes couples refuse to do that, and they go on for years and years and years, and they never talk about their problems. And so discuss it with one another. You know, how could I do a better job of meeting your needs? And what are the main issues that we have to deal with? Years ago, when we first came to this church would send the pastor and his wife every year to Glorietta during a marriage week, marriage enrichment week. They had every fall. It was in October. And we went the first 2 or 3 years and really enjoyed that. It was really nice. And I remember one of those years we went, at Glorietta, we had a workshop, and they had a book. Now, this was years ago, by Dr. Willard Harley. He was a psychologist, a Christian psychologist, and the title of the book is His Needs, Her Needs. It was really good, and it really opened my eyes to show us that men and women have different needs. Just like we have a different love language, we have different needs. And so I highly recommend the book. It's still in print. I think it's really good. And again, some things never change. This thing came out like in 1986, but it's been revised. And he identifies the 5 top needs of most women and the 5 top needs of most men. Now, keep in mind, when he came out with his book, a lot of women were not working outside the home. Some were, but a lot weren't. But I think it still applies. See if you agree. Let me list the top 5 needs of most women according to Willard Harley. This was after years of counseling with couples and talking to them about their issues and their problems and their needs. And he came up with the top 5 things that most women desire in a relationship and the top 5 things that most men would like to have, their needs. For women, the number 1 thing on the list is affection. Is that right, ladies? Affection. And affection, he made clear, is not sex. Okay? It's not sex. It's just showing affection to the wife. Holding hands. Gestures of love. Gifts. You guys send flowers to your wives? You give cards to your wives? You know, I don't do much of that. I've told this many times. Some of you remember this. It's a true story, I'm sad to admit. But at the church we were at before we came here, we lived out in the country there, a little country church, and the church house was right next to the parsonage, and the school was there, and the bar, and all that stuff, post office. And right across the street from the church was the cemetery. And one day Charlotte said, you just never send me flowers. And I said, well, there'll be a funeral soon, and I'll go over there and I'll get you some flowers, from the cemetery. So I was just kidding, of course, but one day, I was sitting on the tailgate of my truck at that church, and church is right next to the parsonage. I'm just sitting out there. It's a nice evening and everything, and this flower truck pulls up. This guy gets out, and he's got this big bouquet of flowers and everything, and he's walking up to me and everything. He said, "Are you the pastor?" And I said, "Yeah." I figured, well, somebody sent some flowers, for the church or something, and I was trying to figure out what this might be. And he said, "Well, these are for you. It's for Randy Davis." And I said, "Really?" And so that's the only time I can ever recall in my life somebody sent me flowers. And so I'm thinking, well, who's this? I know it's not Charlotte, so who is this? And sure enough, it was just somebody in the church had sent me some flowers because my father had recently passed away. And for the first time in my life, I finally got it. A little light went on in my head. I said, oh, that's why women love to get flowers. It lets you know that somebody really loves you and cares about you. And it's an expression of kindness. It's an expression of love. And so it's not about the, I'm so practical. My thought is, well, they're just going to die in a few days. What a waste of money. You're going to spend all this money on these flowers and they're going to die. But it's not about that, is it? It's about the expression of love. It's showing consideration. And even if they just last for a few days, they're beautiful. And it makes somebody feel nice. It makes somebody feel good on the inside. It lets them know that somebody cares about them. Somebody loves them. And so I understand what that's all about. So cards and gifts and flowers and things like that are powerful. Many of you have received a prayer letter from the church. How many of you ever received a prayer letter from the church? Look at that. Just about everybody. And so what we do in our staff meeting every Wednesday is I have a prayer list. And when folks ask me to pray about something, I write that on my little notepad because a dull pencil has a better memory than a sharp mind, right? And I don't have a sharp mind anyway, so I write this stuff down. And so during our staff meeting, we have a time every week where we pull out that prayer list and we talk about prayer concerns, and I ask the staff members, do you know of anybody else that has a prayer need? We write that on the list, and we pray for you. And then we fill out a little sheet that says our church staff was praying for you this week about your needs. And we all sign it. Put your name on it, we sign it. And we say, I can't tell you how many times I've had people tell me how much that meant to them. Just that simple little expression of concern and empathy, showing that somebody knows about my problem and somebody is praying for me and asking God to intervene and just letting me know that you did that. And so that's a powerful thing. And we don't do it just to let people know. We do it because we really care. And it shows people that we care. And so consideration is very important. So to ever get past affection, that's affection for women. The second one is conversation. Conversation. So we've already talked about that, communication. Most women say, my husband doesn't talk to me. We don't talk like we should. The third top need of most women is honesty and openness. Wives want their husbands to be honest and open about what's going on in their lives, in the family. The fourth one is financial support. Now, again, this may have been back when many wives didn't work outside the home, but some did. Came out in 1986, but still, most women, they want to have financial security in the home for their family. So I think that's still a big one. And then the last one, the fifth one, is family commitment. Family commitment, where the husband makes an effort to spend time with the family and to communicate with the family and do things together and all of that. Those are the top 5 needs, according to Willard Harley, that a wife has. Does that sound like that still rings true? Even 35 years later, I think that's still the same, pretty much the same. You might alter it a little bit. What about the men? What do you think the number one need of most men is? Sex. Sexual fulfillment. Most men are visual and physical, and they're driven by that. And so for men, most men, that's the number one thing. And so that's why a guy thinks if you're having sex, that's affection. It doesn't mean the same thing to the woman. They're different things, but to the man, they think it's the same thing. But women know better, right? Secondly is recreational companionship. That's when the wife does things with the husband. That was never a big one for me, like going to sporting events or going camping or stuff like that. I enjoyed doing those things, but never really something that I felt like Charlotte needed to participate in unless she wanted to, So, but for some, I think that is a big deal. Third one is a big deal, I think, for most men. That's an attractive wife, an attractive spouse. That she makes efforts to be pretty, to look attractive to her husband. Now, that doesn't mean she has to be a supermodel, right? Unless she was a supermodel when you got married, right? Just means that making an effort, to look pretty and attractive to her, because again, men are very visual. Oftentimes it's what they see. For women, it's how they feel, and they're relational. For men, it's how they see. And so it's a little different. Fourth is domestic support. I suppose that's just housekeeping. And even though times have changed a lot, I think a lot of guys still kind of would love it if their wives cook meals and help clean the house and those kinds of things, although that may have changed quite a bit with the way our culture has changed. And then the fifth one is admiration, that the husband wants his wife to admire him, to look up to him, and to respect him as the head of the household, those kinds of things. So that's the top 5 needs of most men. Does that sound true today? I think so. I think for the most part it is. So it's so simple, but oftentimes we overlook it. We don't really think about, what does my wife need? Or what does my husband need? And what would the Lord have me to do, to show her or him how much I love them and to express that love in some way. And one of the best things you can do is to neglect yourself to help meet the needs of your spouse. And so that's compromise and consideration in it. Compromising. Being willing to compromise and to make concessions on behalf of your spouse. All right, so we got communication, we got consideration, and we got compromise. The fourth C is courtship. Courtship. If we had more courtship among couples today, we'd probably have less couples in the court. They say the divorce rate is almost the same among Christians as it is among non-Christians. I think that could be true except for faithful Christians. Not everyone who makes a statement of being a Christian is a faithful Christian. I think if you're really, really faithful in your walk with the Lord, you're going to do a much better job of being faithful to your marriage partner, your relationship there. And so I think that would be a big difference. But certainly there needs to be more romance and more attention, more fun in a relationship sometimes than there is after time goes by. Proverbs 5:18 and 19 says, "Be happy with the wife you married when you were young. Let her love always make you happy. Let her love always hold you captive." And so that's something that should go on throughout the marriage, not just at the beginning when things are new and it's exciting and this relationship has just started. And that's something you got to work at, isn't it? It's not something that's just automatic. Again, men are achievers. Once they achieve something, they tend to just quit instead of continuing to work on things. You guys, when you go to the store to buy something, don't you generally know what you're going after before you go? Sometimes you'll walk around and just look, Stores love it when you do that. Generally, you know exactly what you're going after. You go in there and you find it and you bag it, shoot it and bag it, and you're out of there, right? You know exactly what you want. But women love to just walk around and look, just look. May not buy anything, but they like to look. So we're just wired differently that way. And so men are achievers. They achieve something and it's mission accomplished, and now I move on to something else. And a lot of men don't spend a whole lot of time and effort, working on the relationship. I'm not saying some women don't do that as well, but it's something you got to work at. Usually we see each other as husbands and wives at the worst time of the day, don't we? You get home from work, because now most women are working as well. And so you get home from a long day's work and you're tired and you're worn out, and you just want to rest. You just want to get something to eat, watch some TV and go to bed, and you're not really seeing each other at the best time of the day. And so I think it is important to try and find some time every week to just spend some time together, some quality time together. How many of you have a date night with your spouse? Anybody? Not too many, okay. We don't have a regular date night. We used to try and do that on Thursday nights. We did it last Thursday night because it was our anniversary. But most of the time, we wouldn't go out and eat or anything, or it's easier to just go get something and bring it back to the house, or something like that. But if it's a special occasion, we'll make the effort. But I think it's good. I think it's really good to try and plan things you could do together as a couple every week, whether it's the same night every week or not, and just do things together. You can go for a walk. That doesn't cost anything, right? I mean, I love that. How cheap is that? I love that. It doesn't cost anything. Or you can go out and eat, go to a nice restaurant and go out. You can go to the movies. I haven't been to the movies in forever. We just watch stuff on TV most of the time. But go somewhere, do something. You could go to, a Sod Poodles game if you love baseball and enjoy that together. Just something you do together where you spend some time together. And so used to call that a date night. And a lot of couples just don't do that anymore because they're so tired. You got to take care of the kids. You got to get them ready for school the next day, and you got to get them to go to work. And it's a hassle. You may have to get a babysitter if you got young kids, that kind of stuff. But it's really worth it. It's really worth it to make the effort to do those kinds of things. So courtship is very, very important. Keep dating. The fifth one is commitment. A commitment to one another. And I've said this many times, commitment is something in a marriage that you work from. It's not something you work toward. So you don't get married with the idea, well, we're gonna work on this and we're going to get more and more committed to one another. When you get married, you're supposed to be totally committed to one another, and that's something you work from, not something you're working toward. And so absolute commitment to the marriage relationship. In other words, you're saying, we're going to work out our problems, we're going to work out our details that we're having to struggle with and all of that, and we're going to do the very best we can with God's blessing and help to keep our marriage together. We're not going to let our marriage come to an end. Malachi 2:16, God says, I hate divorce. So take heed to yourselves and do not be faithless. Jesus said in Matthew 19:6, therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate. And so God's intention, God's design, God's ideal is that a husband and wife stay together their whole life. Now, a lot of folks, for whatever reason, that hasn't happened. Many of you have been through a divorce. If not, most of us have family members that have been through a divorce, right? So it happens, doesn't it? And so, we're all sinners, saved by grace. We get it wrong sometimes, and it doesn't mean it's the end for you. This means you need to start fresh, right? Start where you're at right now. If you're married now, then be committed to that relationship. If you're not, and you're looking towards another relationship, then be committed in that relationship. You can't undo what's already happened. That's water under the bridge. You can't unscramble an egg. And so you just have to start where you're at, don't you? And so God understands that, and God loves us, and He wants us to stay together. But we know that sometimes, for whatever reason, that simply does not happen. And so sometimes I think couples use the biggest excuse they have for getting divorced today is what? Irreconcilable differences, right? Well, that's a myth. That's a total myth. Anything can be worked out with the Lord's help, right? Any problem can be overcome if you're committed to it and you're trusting in the Lord to help you to do it. And so I think the world has just influenced the church in a lot of ways, and a lot of Christians are feeling like I simply cannot work out the problems. I just got to move on when God can do anything. Now, I know it takes two to tango. Both have to be willing to do that. I always tell couples that are struggling, all you can do is the best you can do. You do your part before the Lord, and then it's up to your spouse to do his or her part. You can't do that for them. They have to do that. You do your part, and then pray that the Lord will lead your spouse to do the same thing. And generally, if you're making a sincere effort and you're doing the best you can to work out the problems and you're making concessions and you're compromising and all of that, your spouse is going to see that, and your spouse is going to reciprocate. They're going to do that too. At least that's been my experience. I've seen that many, many times. And so any problem can be worked out. There's no such thing as an irreconcilable difference. Those things can be worked out. So take a look at that list again. Communication, consideration, compromise, courtship, and commitment. If we'd all focus on that with the Lord's help, don't you think that would make our marriage relationships so much better, so much stronger? And these all come from the word of the Lord. But the last one, the sixth C, is the most important of all, and that is Christ. Christ. The Lord should be the center of your marriage relationship. Paul said in Philippians 2:5, your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus. Jesus is our perfect example, isn't He, for everything. And so the Lord models for us and shows us how we should have the right kind of relationship with other people. And so we need to have the mind of Christ and be totally committed to the Lord if we want our marriages to be strong and healthy the way that God intends. I mentioned that college course I took years ago. And one particular course I had was called Marriage and Family Therapy. I remember that. And it was a small class. It was sponsored by Wayland, but it was here in Amarillo. We met in this small classroom and everything. And there probably wasn't but about 8 or 9 of us in the class. And anyway, we were talking about marriage and family therapy and things like that, actually coming from a more psychological viewpoint than a Christian viewpoint, but most of us were believers in the class. And so anyway, the professor came up with this exercise that he wanted us to do, and he said, I want each one of you to get up, and you can pick any members of the class you want, and you can seat them or position them any way you want, and it's like a human sculpture. Make a sculpture of your marriage relationship. Or if you're not married, what you want it to be like. So I said, okay, I hate stuff like that, you know. So anyway, so he went to each one of us and he said, okay, you get up and you pick some people from the class and you make a sculpture for the rest of the class showing us your marriage relationship. And this young guy in the class, I don't remember his name, but I remember him very clearly. I don't think he'd been married very long at all. Maybe not even married yet. But I think if he wasn't married, he had a girlfriend. Anyway, he got me, and he had me sit in a chair, and he got probably the youngest woman in the class, whoever that was, and had her sit next to me. And he had us hold hands. And he said, now this guy right here, referring to me, this is me. And he said, this lady right here, this is my wife. And we're holding hands, and we love each other, and we're committed to one another and all of that. And then he got the professor. And he had the professor stand behind us and put one hand on my shoulder and the other hand on the woman's shoulder. And he said, so the man in the chair here, me, he says, that's me. The woman is my wife. And he said, the professor is Jesus. And he's right behind us, and he has his hands on both of us because he is the center of our marriage relationship. Isn't that good? I'll never forget that. I thought that kid was really wise to pick the professor to be Jesus, you know. He's a pretty smart kid, you know. But what he did was very powerful. That stuck with me all these years. That was years ago, probably 40 years ago. And I remember that to this day. Jesus should be the center of your marriage. Sometimes couples are struggling and they're not as happy as they ought to be. And it could be some of these C's, these 5 C's on the list. But listen, if you get that 6th one right, if you're totally committed to Christ and to His Word, and you're doing everything possible to transform your marriage into a Christ-centered marriage, you're going to have the best chance of all of having a happy life together, right? God's going to help you to do that. And all of us have to make adjustments from time to time, and all of us have to make concessions and sometimes apologize and sometimes ask for forgiveness. That's just human, right? But when we got the Lord standing behind us, we know it's going to be good. It's going to be powerful. So I think this is good. This is from the Word of God. How to have a happy marriage relationship. It's not really all that difficult to know what to do. It's getting it done that's the challenge. You've got to commit yourself to doing the things that you know will help your marriage to be strong and to be healthy. Is that beneficial? Well, let's all stand and pray.